For 30 years, Johnny Carson was America's favorite nighttime companion. Night after night, he welcomed celebrities into a space that felt relaxed, friendly, and unscripted. Behind that easy charm, however, stood a meticulous professional who demanded firm control over his television domain. The Tonight Show ran on unwritten rules: be entertaining, be engaging, but always follow Johnny's lead. Most guests understood those boundaries. A few spectacularly failed to read the room. They arrived to promote films, albums, or themselves, yet ego, alcohol, or miscalculation pushed them past the invisible line that separated playful banter from genuine discomfort. What makes these moments fascinating is not simply watching famous people unravel on live television. It is watching Carson attempt to hold the show together as laughter fades, tension rises, and control begins to slip. These are 9 rare appearances that became legends precisely because they were never supposed to happen. Let's begin with guest number 1, an artist whose appearance didn't spiral out of control by accident, but by design. When Madonna appeared on The Tonight Show in 1987, she was not yet the untouchable global icon she would later become, but she was already notorious for testing boundaries. She arrived to promote Who's That Girl, and the expectation was a lively, slightly edgy conversation that still respected the rhythm Johnny Carson controlled so carefully. From the moment she stepped onto the stage, that rhythm wavered. Madonna wore black lace and fishnet, closer to lingerie than late-night attire, and the audience reacted with a mix of surprise and curiosity. Carson opened with his usual relaxed banter, but Madonna quickly redirected the exchange. She flirted aggressively, interrupted his pacing, and steered the conversation towards sex and religion subjects. Network television, in the 1,980 seconds, handled cautiously. Several times, Carson's famously controlled expression cracked. When Madonna spoke openly about her sexual life, his tight smile briefly faded, replaced by a look of calculation. It was not outrage, but the clear realization that the conversation had moved into territory he could not fully redirect. Laughter thinned into nervous chuckles, then short silences, as if viewers themselves wanted to pause the moment before it went further. The key question was never whether Madonna understood the rules. It was whether she cared to follow them. Was this a loss of control or a deliberate attempt to seize it? Carson responded the only way he knew how, with restraint. He laughed carefully, shifted topics gently, and avoided confrontation even as the balance of the segment slipped. The interview never fully collapsed, but it never recovered its footing either. Madonna achieved maximum attention, while Carson protected the show from open derailment. She was never invited back. The moment became legendary, not for what she said, but for how visibly rare it was to see Johnny Carson's composure tested. Let's continue with guest number 2, not an outsider or a rebel, but one of Johnny Carson's closest friends. When Don Rickles appeared on The Tonight Show, chaos was usually part of the plan. Rickles was famous for his insult comedy, and Carson welcomed it. Their dynamic followed a familiar rhythm. Rickles attacked Carson, laughed harder than anyone, and the audience felt safe knowing the chaos was carefully contained. But one night, in 1976, that balance broke. The trouble began off-camera. During a previous appearance, while Carson was briefly away from the desk, Rickles sat in the host's chair and accidentally broke Carson's cigarette box, a cherished NBC gift that had sat on the desk for years. The following night, Carson displayed the damaged box on air, jokingly blaming Rickles. It should have ended there. Instead, something unexpected happened. Without warning or invitation, Rickles stormed onto the set mid-segment, still dressed in his Navy uniform from CPO Sharkey. At first, the audience laughed. The surprise was funny. Rickles in costume. Rickles interrupting. But then the tone shifted. He didn't simply interrupt the show. He seized it. He grabbed the desk, shouted across the stage, and unleashed a barrage of insults that felt different from his usual act. This wasn't playful disruption. It was a challenge to the structure of the show itself. Carson smiled and played along, but his control was strained. Was this still comedy, or had Rickles crossed into something else entirely? The laughter thinned. The moment lingered too long. Carson eventually regained control, but backstage the reaction was clear. This wasn't about broken props. It was about broken boundaries. Even friends had limits. Rickles wasn't banned, but the message was unmistakable. For months afterward, Carson kept his distance. The incident became legendary, not because it was funny, but because it revealed something rare. Even Johnny Carson could be momentarily overrun, if only by someone who thought friendship placed him above the rules. Let's move to guest number 3, whose appearance didn't challenge Johnny Carson's authority with ego or intention, but with complete unpredictability. When Oliver Reed appeared on The Tonight Show in 1975, he already carried a reputation for excess. Known for his talent, as much as for his heavy drinking, Reed arrived to promote Royal Flash. What neither Carson nor the producers expected was just how visibly impaired he would be once the cameras rolled. From the moment Reed sat down, the problem was obvious. His movements were unsteady, his eyes unfocused, and his speech slurred enough that the rhythm of the conversation immediately collapsed. Carson, a master at guiding difficult guests, tried to steer things back on course with standard promotional questions. Reed ignored them. He interrupted, rambled, and veered into incoherent tangents that had nothing to do with the film. At first the audience laughed, unsure whether this was eccentric charm or an act. Then the laughter thinned. Reed's tone shifted without warning, drifting from playful to confrontational. He challenged Carson, talked over him, and injected an edge of hostility that made the exchange increasingly uncomfortable. Carson's calm never vanished, but it tightened. Each attempt to redirect only emphasized how little control remained. This was not provocation. It was chemical chaos. Reed was not playing with boundaries. He was incapable of seeing them. The audience sensed it, and the room grew quiet. For one of the few times in his career, Carson made the decision to end a segment early, a clear signal that the situation had moved beyond recovery. The fallout was lasting. Studios watching at home saw confirmation of every fear surrounding Reed's reputation. He was never invited back. The appearance became a cautionary tale, not just about alcohol, but about how even the most controlled television environment can unravel when a guest arrives unable to meet its most basic expectation, coherence. Let's continue with guest number 4, a literary giant whose appearance exposed not ego or rebellion, but a quiet public unraveling. When Truman Capote appeared on The Tonight Show in 1980, Johnny Carson expected a conversation worthy of the man who wrote In Cold Blood and Breakfast at Tiffany's. Capote had dazzled on late-night television before offering sharp observations and elegant wit. This time, however, something was immediately wrong. From his first answers, Capote struggled to focus. His speech was slurred, his movements erratic, and his thoughts drifted in circles. Carson, who genuinely admired literary figures, tried patiently to guide him toward safe ground books, writing ideas. Capote resisted, wandering into fragmented stories and provocative comments that clashed with the show's carefully maintained tone. At moments, flashes of the old brilliance appeared only to dissolve again into confusion. The audience reacted cautiously at first, laughing when they thought a punchline might arrive. Then the laughter faded. What they were watching no longer felt like eccentricity. It felt like decline unfolding in real time. Carson's calm never disappeared, but it grew heavier. He slowed the pace, shortened questions, and quietly absorbed the discomfort rather than expose his guest further. The key tension wasn't confrontation. It was uncertainty. How long could this continue without becoming cruel? Carson faced a choice: cut the segment and humiliate a troubled man, or let it run and risk discomfort. He chose restraint. The interview limped to its end, unresolved and unsettling. Capote was never invited back. Unlike other incidents, there was no anger behind the decision, only recognition. The appearance marked a sad turning point, capturing a moment when a celebrated mind could no longer meet the demands of live television. It remains one of the most uncomfortable segments in Tonight Show history, not because it was explosive, but because it revealed vulnerability that Carson could not fully protect from the camera. Let's move on to guest number 5, a force of personality whose unpredictability pushed even Johnny Carson's patience to its limit. When Shelley Winters appeared on The Tonight Show, unpredictability was part of the appeal. An Academy Award-winning actress with a booming presence, Winters was known for dominating conversations, but usually in ways that felt entertaining rather than disruptive. On this particular night, however, that balance vanished. What began as a lively panel discussion quickly shifted. A comment from another guest accounts differ on who triggered something in Winters. Her tone sharpened. She interrupted. Then she stood pointing fingers, turning what should have been casual late-night banter into an emotional confrontation. The room froze. This was not playful assertiveness. It was a release of long-simmering grievances about Hollywood aging and respect. At first, the audience laughed uncertainly, unsure whether this was a performance. Then the laughter thinned. Carson tried his usual tools: humor, gentle redirection, calm authority. None of it worked. Winters continued louder and more agitated, speaking less to the couch beside her and more to years of perceived slights. Carson's expression changed. He shuffled his note cards, paused longer between sentences, and searched for an exit that wouldn't humiliate his guest. The tension reached a point Carson rarely allowed. He called for a commercial break, a move insiders long described as his nuclear option. It wasn't punishment, it was containment. When the show returned, Winters was calmer, but the atmosphere remained strained, the easy rhythm permanently broken. Unlike others who crossed the line, Winters wasn't banished. Carson understood her volatility was part of her persona. Still, the message was clear. Even a force of nature could be redirected, paused, and quietly managed. The moment endured not because it exploded, but because it showed the exact point where Carson's patience stopped being elastic and became procedural. Let's move on to guest number 6, a man who was supposed to be one of the safest seats on Johnny Carson's couch. When Buddy Hackett appeared on The Tonight Show, the format was usually effortless. Hackett was a trusted storyteller, famous for long animated monologues that required little more than Carson's occasional prompt. The audience expected laughter. Carson expected reliability. What they did not expect was a mood that felt heavy from the start. Hackett began as usual, telling stories with his familiar energy. But gradually the tone shifted. The humor thinned, replaced by frustration. His anecdotes drifted away from playful exaggeration and toward resentment. He began criticizing people in Hollywood he believed had wronged him, naming names and settling scores rather than delivering punchlines. At first, the audience laughed out of habit, then the laughter stalled. Was this still comedy, or had the couch turned into something else entirely? Carson tried to redirect the conversation towards safer topics, projects, memories, lighter ground, but Hackett resisted. Each attempt to steer the segment back only made the bitterness more apparent. Carson's expression tightened. His pauses grew longer. The rhythm that normally carried Hackett's stories collapsed under the weight of personal grievance. The room grew uncomfortable. This wasn't a meltdown fueled by alcohol or ego. It was emotional spillover, raw and unresolved. Carson faced a familiar dilemma: allow a trusted guest to continue unraveling or step in and risk exposing him. He chose control. The segment was cut short and the show moved on without explanation. Backstage, Carson wasn't angry. He was concerned. Hackett had broken the unspoken contract of the show, not by being offensive, but by being uncontained. He did return in later years, restored to form, but the incident lingered as a reminder. Even the most dependable guests could cross the line not by shouting but by forgetting that The Tonight Show was never meant to be therapy, only entertainment carefully held together by restraint. Let's continue with guest number 7, whose appearance didn't unravel slowly but collapsed in an instant. When Red Fox appeared on The Tonight Show in 1975, he was already a television icon thanks to Sanford & Son. His visit was meant to be routine promotion, nothing more. Yet within minutes, it became one of the shortest and most uncomfortable guest appearances in the show's history. The tension began before Fox even settled in. A heavy smoker, he assumed he would be allowed to light up on set, as had been common in earlier years of television. But by the mid-1970 seconds, NBC's rules had changed. When Carson politely explained that smoking was no longer permitted, Fox's demeanor shifted immediately. Carson laughed lightly, treating the exchange as a joke, expecting the moment to pass. It didn't. Fox wasn't performing. He stood up and made it clear he would not continue without a cigarette. In a matter of seconds, what felt like banter turned into confrontation. The audience fell silent, unsure whether they were witnessing a bit or a genuine rupture. Then Fox walked off the stage, leaving Carson alone at the desk. The shock wasn't just that Fox left, but how abruptly control evaporated. There was no build-up, no escalation, only a sudden refusal to comply with the structure of the show. Carson recovered quickly, offering a brief remark before moving on, but the damage had already been done. Authority had been challenged publicly, and the room knew it. Fox was not permanently banned, but the relationship cooled. The incident became legendary, not for drama, but for its speed. It demonstrated how fragile the balance could be when a guest rejected even the most basic rule. In a show defined by smooth continuity, Fox's walkout remains a reminder that sometimes chaos doesn't roar. Sometimes it simply stands up and leaves. Let's move on to guest number 8, whose fallout with Johnny Carson didn't happen in a single explosive moment, but unfolded slowly and cut deeper than any on-air meltdown. When Joan Rivers sat on the Tonight Show couch, she wasn't just a frequent guest. She was Carson's trusted substitute, a comedian he openly positioned as a potential successor. Their dynamic was sharp, fast, and familiar. Rivers pushed boundaries, but always within a framework Carson controlled. For years, it worked. The tension didn't erupt on a single night. Instead, it built quietly. Rivers began to stretch her role, interrupting more, pressing harder, occasionally stepping into Carson's rhythm rather than dancing around it. On air, the moments felt subtle. A pause held too long. A joke that landed just a beat too sharp. The audience laughed, but the balance had shifted. The real rupture came off camera. When Rivers accepted a competing late-night show without telling Carson first, it wasn't viewed as ambition. It was viewed as betrayal. The unspoken rule had been broken, not about jokes or tone, but about loyalty and control. Carson never confronted her publicly. He didn't need to. Silence was the punishment. Rivers was never invited back. No dramatic ban, no explanation on air, just erasure. For a woman once positioned as Carson's heir, the message was devastatingly clear. This wasn't about ego or gender or rivalry. It was about authority. Carson could tolerate disruption on his stage. What he would not tolerate was a challenge to the structure that made the stage his. Their story remains one of the most painful in late-night history, not because it played out in front of the audience, but because it didn't. Power in Carson's world rarely needed spectacle. Sometimes it simply closed the door and never opened it again. Let's finish with guest number 9, whose clash with Johnny Carson unfolded not through chaos or collapse, but through open resistance. When Chevy Chase appeared on The Tonight Show, the tension was apparent almost immediately. Chase was riding high on success, known for his sharp wit, confidence, and a reputation for testing limits. What should have been a standard late-night appearance instead became one of the rare occasions when Carson allowed friction to remain visible on air. From the opening exchange, the rhythm felt wrong. Chase interrupted more than expected delivered jokes with an edge that felt dismissive rather than playful, and treated the couch less like a stage to perform on and more like a place to spar. Carson attempted to guide the conversation with his usual measured calm, but Chase repeatedly stepped on the beat. The audience laughed, but not freely. The laughter carried hesitation. This wasn't intoxication or emotional spillover. It was ego. Chase didn't misread the room. He challenged it. The question hanging in the air was whether this was a bit or a test. Carson's response was subtle but unmistakable. He shortened his questions. He slowed the pace. He allowed pauses to stretch instead of smoothing them over. For once, he did not rush to rescue the moment. As the segment continued, the atmosphere tightened. Laughter faded into scattered chuckles, then silence. The power struggle was no longer hidden beneath humor. Carson maintained control not by confrontation, but by restraint, letting the discomfort speak for itself. The desk remained the center of gravity. The interview eventually moved on, but the ease never returned. Chase was not banned nor publicly criticized. Instead, the relationship cooled. The appearance became a quiet lesson in Carson's authority. You could bring confidence, you could bring sharpness, but if you tried to dominate the structure itself, the show would not bend to accommodate you. In the end, the desk always won. Taken together, these 9 moments reveal far more than isolated celebrity misbehavior. Over 30 years on the air, Johnny Carson welcomed thousands of guests onto The Tonight Show. Only a handful became legendary for losing control, and that rarity is the point. Carson did not build a platform designed to absorb chaos. He built a system designed to prevent it. What distinguished Carson was not authority expressed through dominance, but authority exercised through restraint. When guests remained entertaining, even provocative, he gave them space. When they crossed into discomfort, he intervened quietly. A pause, a shortened question, a shift to commercial. His goal was never to expose failure, but to protect the audience from it. Even when guests embarrassed themselves, Carson avoided humiliation whenever possible. These incidents also highlight a philosophy that feels almost foreign in modern media. Today, disruption is often amplified, clipped, and rewarded. Awkwardness becomes content. Conflict becomes currency. Carson operated by the opposite logic. Chaos was not an opportunity. It was a problem to be solved quickly and discreetly. If a guest could not respect that boundary, the consequence was not outrage, but absence. Perhaps most revealing is how rarely Carson needed to enforce that power openly. He didn't shout, insult, or retaliate. His authority came from structure. The desk, the rhythm, the expectations. Guests could challenge him, but they could not escape that framework. In a fragmented media landscape built on viral moments, Carson's approach seems almost old-fashioned. Yet these rare breakdowns endure precisely because they violated something stable. They remind us that the most remarkable thing about Carson's reign was not the chaos that surfaced, but how seldom it was allowed to.